Welcome to this little note session on Cold War, wait for it, conflicts. We're going to be discussing in this version Asia, not the supergroup from the 80s, but the continent. So, we're going to be talking specifically 3 countries in Asia that had conflicts that drew us in further into the Cold War. The first one we talked about was China. These were all in class. You should have a basic understanding of them, but I wanted to pull them up on the map. Then we have the Korean conflict, which takes place over here. And then Vietnam, which is here. They're all connected, both countries, with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Chinese Civil War. If you look, the countries are all next to China, and that's what makes China very important in Asia and early in the Cold War. So we're going to discuss these 3 countries. Pulled up the map just to give you some semblance of where they fall on the globe. And we're going to talk about each one individually. So we're going to start with the Chinese Civil War. So the big takeaway, go with this. Underline, we have the Chinese Civil War. The 2 leaders, Chiang Kai-shek, remember him from World War II. He's our buddy, he's a nationalist, he's the current leader. During World War II and at the end of World War II, he's the nationalist leader, anti-communist leader of China. Chinese Civil War is being fought before the Japanese invaded. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, who is the communist leader. Mao Zedong was the man who was trying to overthrow Chiang Kai-shek and a nationalist and install a communist regime in China. He wanted land reform and to give people, the common people, more power, but eventually he becomes what many will call a communist style dictator, very controlling. They put their differences aside to fight the Japanese during World War II. After World War II is over, they resume their civil war, and in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek is forced to leave China. Oops. My bad. We'll do this. Hold on a second. Sorry about the technical difficulties. We're back on track here. Chiang Kai-shek is forced to leave China. He goes to the island of Formosa, which is now called Taiwan. And we'll get into that in a second. You'll learn much more about that next year in World Cultures. But for the sake of the Cold War, I'm going to give you a little background. So the China saga is going to go as such. Chiang Kai-shek leaves China to the island of Formosa, which is off the coast. I'll show you a map shot of that in a second. The island's now called Taiwan, and that is the official China that is recognized in the UN until 1971, and we'll talk about that when we get into the 70s in the United States. But we take the nationalist China and we call them the official government of China, even though they lost the Civil War. So we'll talk about that in a second. Editor's note, Taiwan is misspelled. In the video, it should be T-A, not T-I. Sorry about that. Consider the correction made. Have a good day. So we have China. I'm going to change the color here, if I can. Here's the capital up here, Beijing. Taiwan, I'm going to give it the nationalist blue. Used to be called Formosa. The government leaves China and goes to Taiwan. That's who we recognize up through 1971 as the official government of China. Communist China is country we don't really have too many relations with. The problem is, because China is communist, they have a lot of influence in both Vietnam, which is here, and Korea, which is over here. And that'll give us problems moving forward. So moving on to Korea. North Korea, remember the Soviet Union came down and attacked at the end of the war because the Japanese had occupied Korea. The United States drove from the south and we stopped here, the 38th parallel. That's the sign for parallel, so we'll use that. Japan's over here, so you can see how close Japan is to the east or to the right, how close it is to Korea. 38th parallel, which eventually is going to become the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. Kind of a cool rapper name. So Korea, at the end of World War II, inadvertently gets divided into two sections. The Russian section in the north, which of course is communist, that's why I have it in red, because Soviet Union's communist, and then the Americans liberate the south from the Japanese, and they want their own form of government in there, which the guy happens to be a dictator also. So we're taking, like, we want our guy, he's anti-communist, he's a dictator, but he's anti-communist. The North Koreans, backed by Russia, want their guy, and we're at a standstill. This is the shortened version, because we've already talked about this in class. North Korea attacks South Korea. The United States gets the UN, United Nations, which is newly formed, to help out. MacArthur, we'll talk about him in a second, he attacks and he pushes the North Koreans back. The problem is he's told not to go up across the Yalu River into China, and he does. This brings the Chinese down in full force. And after 3 years of fighting, we end up back at the DMZ. With an unofficial, we have an official truce but no peace treaty. So after 3 years of fighting, we end up back where we started, and things don't go well. MacArthur gets fired. We're still at a state of hostilities with North Vietnam to this day, and the country is still divided. So we have communist North Korea, non-communist South Korea, divided by the DMZ, which is the 38th parallel. Got that? Good. Key takeaway besides the war stopping where it started, General MacArthur fired, not a very good fire, but a little attempt at visual aids, fired by President Harry S. Truman for not following orders and basically talking back and trying to make Truman look foolish, thinking he was bigger than the president and bigger than having to take orders. But as president, you get to command the armed forces, and he gets to tell MacArthur what to do. Moving on to Vietnam. Okay, so French Indochina. Sorry about the writing. It's on a slanted iPad with a stylus. French Indochina. It's a French colony before World War II. Then the Japanese take it over during World War II. Because of Vichy France is being controlled by Germany, Japan goes to the Germans and says, hey, we need the colony. French are forced to give it up. Then after the war, the French want it back. This is after World War II. And remember, the whole time you have Vietnamese fighting the French, trying to get them out. Then During World War II, they continue fighting the Japanese. And then after the war, they continue fighting the French. So they're fighting for their freedom the whole time, trying to get foreign influences out of their country. That's a major takeaway. They're fighting a war for independence, and the other countries are fighting for natural resources. Kind of skewers things a bit in perspective. So the timeline, after the war, the Vietnamese are fighting the French, who are trying to get back into Vietnam and continue it as a colony. 1950, the United States sends in MAG, their military advisors, the Military Assistance Advisory Group. But remember, they're not guys with briefcases and bow ties. They are high-end military, special service, Green Beret, highly trained military advisors. They're going in to help fight the communist insurgency. 1954, the French are finally pushed out, and Vietnam is divided into North and South. The takeaway from Vietnam is the U.S. is involved into the 1970s. We're going to keep revisiting Vietnam throughout the 60s and 70s because of the repercussions from the actions and everything that's going on over there. So this wraps up the... Let me see if I can get out of this. Save and clear board. Pull up our map. There we go. We are going to wrap up our China, Korea, and Vietnam video. We will keep talking about these three countries, even though the major events happened in the 40s and 50s. Korea still goes on today. Vietnam will go through the 60s and 70s with us, cause a huge upheaval in the United States. And China is one of our largest trading partners today, even though they are a communist nation. They still affect policy in the United States. So that wraps up the talk on these three topics. There'll be more to come. If you have any questions, please zip me a message in Edmodo or send me an email and let me know what you need clarified from class. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you guys for listening to the music.